Okay, I started the event prematurely, and unfortunately, there's no way to unstart it without canceling the whole thing, which seems rather harsh. So I'll just be sitting here fiddling, doing some computer things. So if you want to watch me do that, you can. Not much is going to be happening. Let's see. Okay, let me get my phone. What do I do with my phone? All right, well, let me go look for it. Let's see. Okay. Hey, Jeff? Can you speak?
Tom,
Okay, just want to make sure I can hear you. Can you hear me?
barely. They turn it up.
Hold on a minute. Is this any better?
That's a little better.
Should be a lot better. Wonder what the problem
A lot
is.
better?
I said it should be a lot better. Huh. Wonder what could be going on.
Hold on a second. Now try it.
Okay, how does this sound?
Oh, yeah, that's much better.
Okay, all right. Just to make sure I'm using the right microphone, can you tell me if you hear a boom, boom, boom noise?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I am using the correct microphone. Okay. I accidentally pressed the start button so the world can see us. So what I meant to click was, I don't know, I made a mistake. And the thing is, you can't turn it off because the options it gives you, it's like nuclear Armageddon. It's either one thing or the other. There's no way to end this just so that we can go quiet for 30 minutes. If I turn this off, the event is canceled. So,
oh no.
So I got to go downstairs until showtime. So I could put a sign up saying, "Everybody wait," but I think they'll figure it out when they see there's nobody sitting here.
That's right.
All right. Okay. So I'll meet you up here. I'm glad everything's working out fine, and I'll meet you up here in 25 minutes. Okay.
Say, Tom, one question.
Yep.
I've got these three buttons: turn webcam on, turn microphone on, which I've done, and then I've got turn screen share on.
Oh, you definitely don't want that. That would be like if you had a PowerPoint you wanted us to look at.
Okay.
You're fine the way it is.
I won't touch that.
Okay.
All right.
All right. See you soon.
Right.
Just grabbing my phone.
Nice phone.
Oh, I have to check something. Sorry, hang on a minute. Then I'll leave.
No problem.
Log in. All right, campaigns. Did that send? I guess so. Okay. All right. Because I sent a 1 hour reminder at 7, but I just
I
don't
got it.
remember. Okay, so it did go out. Okay, I just don't remember
Yeah.
getting it. But that's partly because I'm getting ready for a trip tomorrow, and I don't do that much traveling anymore. And it's really throwing me for a loop. I mean, it's
It's
'cause I've
horrible.
gotta-
Traveling is horrible.
well, also I got to cover, the show while I'm gone, and
Yeah.
which is fine. But the following week, I'm going to be gone 5 days. I'm taking another daughter to New York for 5 days, and I really want to
Wow.
have 5 episodes for that week. So the only
Right.
time I can record those is this week, which means the only time I can
Yeah.
record them is on Friday. So,
Ouch.
yeah. Okay. By the way, are you going to be at the conference next month?
I will be, but only on Friday.
What? Why?
Yeah. Well, my youngest son has his senior music recital on Saturday.
Well, so when are you leaving? Saturday morning or Friday night?
I'm leaving Friday night. Yeah. 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 Why?
'Cause
You
I'm
don't get there till
coming.
Saturday, right?
I'm gonna go. So I'll at least see you
Well,
Friday.
yeah, we'll have to make the most of Friday because that's all I've got.
Are you flying in Friday or Thursday night?
No, Thursday night. Thursday night. I will be there Thursday night.
But super late?
I think the plane gets into Atlanta at 6:30, maybe. So it's not super late.
Do you want to? Would you want to try and have dinner at Provino's?
Yeah, sure.
At least that.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, this is
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
sad. I thought, I wasn't even going to tell you. I was just going to surprise you and show up. But
That would have been
I'm
great.
glad I know now because now I can cope with this in advance.
Right.
But is Sean is going
Right.
to be giving the Lou Church lectures. He's staying the whole time?
Well, he's not. He can't come. Yeah, he won't be there Friday. He, I know.
This is the
I
worst
know.
thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
So, all right, so half the Grove City contingent will keep me company one day and half the other.
Yeah. It's Click and Clack, the Tappet Brothers. There we go.
Ah, okay. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, look, you got to be there for your son.
Right. That's the
Yeah.
thing.
All right. Okay. 20 minutes. I'll be back.
All right. Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, sorry, I guess I'm a minute late. I apologize for that. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I've got Jeff Herbiner here. We're going to do our Q&A session here on economics. So let's make sure to remember, please, it helps me a little bit to use the little question option toward the bottom of the chat window that you guys have. And let's jump right in. I hope you, obviously you got the email, so you know that Jeff later this year is going to be cooking up a great new course for us. So I just got in here. Let's see. All right, so far no questions. Yeah, and by the way, I don't normally sit in this chair. Somebody was asking, I have a chair on wheels, but it makes noises, and I was doing some audiobook recording earlier today, and I didn't want the creaking noises creeping in, so that's why I'm sitting in this wooden chair with no wheels on it. Okay, Jeff. Well, we're waiting people to submit their questions on economics, so let's see what they have to say.
All right. It's a typical period where nothing interesting in economics is going on.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah, nothing interesting indeed. Well, glad that your conference went well, Austrian Student Scholars Conference.
Yeah, it went great. You saw the pictures of the Thomas E. Woods Prize winners?
I did see that. That was very, very nice to see, indeed. So,
yeah, they were excellent, excellent papers.
That's good. Good to hear. Folks, this doesn't work if you don't ask questions. So, all right. So we got a question here. Yeah. Okay. So I guess the chat, does it always go in reverse like this? Where the top one, maybe it does. Okay. All right. Okay, let's read this one. This is a long one. Jeff, are you seeing this by Malcolm?
No, I can't see the question.
All right. Well, and you can see the chat, by the way, if you want to, by clicking on the chat icon. It's like a voice bubble with 3 dots in it. And if you click on that, you'll see what everybody's saying. Do you see?
No, I just see I see an icon with a couple of people, has a number of participants.
Yeah, and then below that to the left, there should be like a light blue strip with a bunch of icons.
Oh,
vertical.
okay.
You see a vertical strip of icons?
I do.
And then one of them is a voice bubble with 3 dots in it.
Right, I got it now. Okay, I'm
all
on.
the same, I'll still read out the question. In the Federal Reserve Museum, there is a plaque that says the reason the public was against the First Bank of the United States was because 70% of the stock was owned by foreigners. I've searched and searched, but could not find out who owned that stock and how the offering was done. Can either of you speak about foreign financing of the revolution and the counter-revolution of the Constitution of the United States? To what extent and at what point were foreigners trying to influence affairs in the colonies? What books would you recommend on the early bonds, banking, financing of slavery, real estate in the early colonies? Anything on this?
Well, I would say a good book. I'm not sure if it touches on all of these particular issues, but a really good book on the early finance is by Davis Dewey, who's the brother of John Dewey. And he wrote a book, I think it's just called Financial History of the U.S. or something like that. And it's a really nicely done, descriptive account of the financial affairs, especially the federal government. And so I don't recall at the top of my head if it talks about this issue about foreign ownership of stock of the first bank, but it probably does. I mean, it talks about those sorts of issues, and it chronicles the federal budget and all the activities of the regulatory activities and the expenses and so on of all that intervention by the federal government. So I think it would be a good source to try. There are reprints of this book. It's in the public domain, and so it is available. I have a paperback copy of it.
Okay. How much do you think automatic contributions to 401ks, et cetera, contribute to stock/mutual fund price inflation?
Well, I don't. Yeah, I don't know the exact answer to that. I don't think it's a cause probably of inflation in the way that we think of it over the boom bust. It wouldn't generate inflationary bubbles, I wouldn't think, but it certainly would provide a steady stream of purchase of stocks and bonds and so on. I've been reading in the financial press that what seems to be driving the volatility of the stock market right now is just borrowed money. It's just a typical thing, right? It's a lot of people going to debt and just buying stock.
Okay, let's try this one. In Robert Murphy's course on the history of economics, history of economic thought, on the calculation problem, Bob seems to say that the calculation problem was resolved using Walras' mathematical model. And I didn't understand if that model was a valid response to Mises' challenge. Was this challenge actually answered?
Okay, no, I think there are a couple things going on here. I think perhaps what Bob's referring to is the Walrasian model, and Mises agrees with this, of course, allows you to describe general equilibrium states of affairs. And if the economy were ever in this kind of stationary state, then of course we wouldn't need economic calculation. We would know exactly how to allocate resources, and Mises liked to call this state the evenly rotating economy, where production and consumption and trade and so on would just repeat over and over day by day. And so if you ever reached a world of equilibrium, no change, no uncertainty, no need for entrepreneurial prediction, no need for further allocation of resources to improve economizing in the economy, well, then you wouldn't need economic calculation. So I'm pretty sure that's what Bob's referring to here. Mises goes on in a very long and effective rebuttal to that being an answer to the actual problem of economic calculation in socialism. So if the socialists rise up and convince the proletariat to rise up and butcher the capitalists and take over the machines, they would not be able to actually know how to calculate the step-by-step process of altering the path of the use of resources to reach whatever equilibrium they had in mind that they wanted to achieve. And so the problem is really a problem of entrepreneurial anticipation and how you move from a given state that isn't in equilibrium to a given state that you wish to achieve that might be described as equilibrium. And mathematical descriptions in the absence of change and calculation and so on don't address that question.
How about this one? What's a simple way to explain the process of how the Fed manipulates interest rates? I get that question actually a lot, Jeff, so this would be a good... Regina was actually asking me that, as a matter of fact.
Oh, boy. Okay, well, interest rates are, just like any price in a market, determined by supply and demand. And in this case, supply of credit or loanable funds, and then demand for credit or for borrowing. And so the Fed attempts to manipulate this interest rate by providing more supply of credit. And it's a little bit complicated as to how they attempt to do this, because they do this through the banking system. But the simple, straightforward procedure is for them to expand, or have the banks on their behalf expand the supply of credit, and then ceteris paribus, with given demand for credit, this would reduce interest rates, or at least keep interest rates below what they would have been otherwise.
How about this? Is it even possible to know what the real, quote, inflation rate, I think I mean price inflation, is when entrepreneurs are making things more efficient, thus presumably deflating prices, while the government is printing money, which should inflate prices? So I'll just leave it there. I mean, of course, that's a legitimate question, but therefore the price inflation is just what we observe, and then we can try and figure out just speculatively what it might have been in the absence of the intervention. And we know that the natural tendency is for prices to fall, but the only thing we can report on with a number is what we can perceive, as opposed to what we can see only with our mind's eye, I would think.
Right. So in any economy, there would be those two factors involved in affecting the purchasing power of money, or the array of prices in the economy. There's a supply of money that's being manipulated by the Fed, and then there's our demand for money, which is based upon these real factors of production and consumption and so on, how much money we wish to have to engage in our transactions and to hold as a hedge against uncertainty and so on. So it's those two factors always that are driving the price inflation or deflation or stability of money as we move forward. Now, the other aspect of this, of course, is that for any given person, or let's say an entrepreneur running a business, they of course are not so worried about the general change in purchasing power of money. They're worried about what's going to happen to the prices of their inputs and prices of their outputs as they move forward. So they're more interested in the microeconomic factors that influence their own decisions and how they play out. The same with families. They're not so concerned. It would be a secondary thing for them to be concerned about the purchasing power of money overall. What they're really concerned about is the purchasing power of money for the things that they are going to buy. And as Mises points out, once you recognize that, you can see that as far as human action goes, there are an indefinite number of ways to calculate what's happening to the purchasing power of money. And each one depends upon the interests of the person who's doing the calculating. So, there's really, we're lost really in a sea of uncertainty about exactly how, as economists, if we want an objective measure of the purchasing power of money, how to go about this. So Mises actually concludes that there's no scientific way to construct a price index that would give us a definitive claim about what's happening with the purchasing power of money. Once we have these two forces interacting, once we have monetary manipulation on the side of the Fed, then we're just really at a loss to actually tell definitively what's going on. We can have a general idea as to when price inflation is picking up and when it's slowing down and so on. But aside from that, we really don't have anything we can repair to in order to say, oh yeah, inflation was 2% last year, or as our new Fed chair says, he's willing to allow for 2.5% price inflation as the new policy goal, not just 2%. So from Mises's viewpoint, or from a sound economic viewpoint, this is nonsense. Of course, you can't even tell what the difference between 2 and 2.5% is. He has no metric to measure this.
How about this one? Let's do one at a time. It's two completely different questions. Why did the Founding Fathers choose a bimetallic fixed value system rather than let the value float? So I guess that is to say, why did they define gold and silver in terms of some ratio when they could have just let the market decide that, given the value of gold and the value of silver, this is the ratio in which they ought to exchange against each other? Now, the part of the Constitution dealing with the regulation of money falls in the part having to do with the regulation of weights and measures. So they weren't, sometimes people use that as a excuse for why we can have a Federal Reserve, but obviously they weren't saying, by putting it in that clause, they were not saying the government should have the authority to debase the currency at will, but rather I think they were thinking in terms of measurement. And I think they thought that, for the sake of everybody's convenience, we ought to have some kind of measurement. But it is true that does lead to the question, surely they understood market economics well enough to know that there's no reason to think that these metals would persist in the same ratio over time.
Yeah, I don't know of any documentary evidence with respect to their views on the economics of exchange ratios between these metals, whether they grasp the abstract possibility. Of course, empirically, it didn't take too long for silver to devalue against gold. It was in the early 1800s, so only maybe 10 years under the Mintage Act when the ratio was 15-1 where they set it. But I think the problem perhaps stemmed from the very notion that the federal government, or at least Congress, was taking on the power to actually establish a currency. Because in the Mintage Act, it's the dollar that's defined, both as a weight of gold and as a weight of silver, that then involves a 15-1 ratio, which was the market ratio at the time, between the two metals. It's that the Treasury Department stood ready to redeem gold and silver at that ratio because they defined the dollar as a currency unit in terms of both metals. And this is where the problem lies, right? As Rothbard points out, if you trace back the names of monies back in history, you'll find that they're typically just these weights of metals. And so if we just had gold grams or something as the name of the money, well, then this problem would never arise. No one would ever think, hey, the United States has a sovereign power to define the currency, and then they can define it in one metal or two metals or three metals or however many they want. So it's a strange combination of wrong-headed thinking. I also believe there was some compromise between the Jeffersonians, who wanted a gold standard, and the Hamiltonians, who wanted silver. So I think there was some political maneuvering and perhaps a compromise to establish a bimetallic system. You may also recall that just as Mises points out, when a country fixes the exchange rate between these two metals like that, defines the currency in terms of two metals at a fixed rate, once the market rate deviates from the fixed legal rate, the monetary system actually alternates. It alternates between one money and the other. And so we were on a silver standard for most of the early 19th century. And then it was Andrew Jackson who revalued the metals and brought gold back into the system. And then the gold rush of 49, he valued gold against silver, and silver was pushed out, and we went to a de facto gold standard. So even if the founding fathers didn't understand the problems involved, certainly the problems reared their head in the later decades before the Civil War, and certainly must have been a widely understood phenomenon by then.
What are the inflationary risks in a hard currency, such as what happened during Solomon's day? So I guess is the question, even if you were using a money like gold, maybe the question is what would happen if you had a major discovery of a new source of gold?
Well, I mentioned the California gold rush in 1949 already. The estimate of the effect on purchasing power of money from this vast, unprecedented increase in gold mining was roughly 2% per year. And I don't think it was any worse in the Alaskan gold strikes of the 1890s. So this is really, it's a red herring argument. And if you think about this more it's a red herring argument to say, well, look, we're going to have really a hyperinflation or a horrible, terrible, destructive inflation. If somebody finds a cheap way to mine gold or something. No such thing has ever occurred. Historically, I mean, maybe the best case I can think of off the top of my head, I don't know about the Solomon thing, but would be the Spanish exploitation of the gold and silver mines in the New World. But again, that only created, the estimates are maybe 5 to 6% price inflation, which is relatively modest. I mean, it's manageable for entrepreneurs to be in an environment where you have 5 or 6% price inflation. By the way, if it were suppose we think of this in the abstract, suppose the whole world were on a gold standard. Everyone was on a gold standard. And there was a big gold strike in one particular country. And we asked the question, would that then lead to a massive inflation in that country, even if it were, say, a 50% increase in the gold stock in 2 years or something like that? And the answer is no, because the gold would simply be exported to where its purchasing power was more valuable. As its purchasing power fell in the gold mining country, the people who possess gold would simply start to buy foreign goods and invest in foreign countries where the purchasing power of the gold was higher. And the gold would be distributed across all people who wanted to hold it so that its purchasing power was the same. This, again, is a well-known economic theory of the purchasing power parity of any particular money.
So just to make sure people follow this, the idea would be that if there's a discovery of gold in territory A, and therefore there's a lot of gold that's being spent on a lot of things, and that's pushing the price of those things up. Since the gold hasn't yet penetrated into the rest of the world, prices are more or less unchanged in the rest of the world. So while prices are going to go up in that gold discovery country, and therefore the purchasing power of the gold is going to fall, that hasn't happened yet in the rest of the world. So people will eventually say, well, forget buying domestic goods, I'll buy things in foreign countries. And that is what is going to disseminate the gold around the world and resolve this.
And by the way, the other aspect of this is it doesn't necessarily take a lot of time or a volatility of the prices in the gold mining country for this to occur, because speculators can simply step in and see this in advance and start to buy up the gold as it's being produced in the gold mining country and hold it for a while and then distribute it across the world where its value is rising. So it really is, there's no evidence or argument that seems very persuasive that this would be problematic.
Let's see. Let's try and make sure everybody gets a chance to ask something. Somebody asked, do you guys recommend reading Human Action or Man, Economy, and State first? I have always recommended reading Man, Economy, and State first, and I would be surprised if Jeff disagreed with that.
Right. Well, if you're interested in economics, definitely Man, Economy, and State first. It's just more accessible. And then you have the background to read Human Action. But if you're interested in broader philosophical, historical, history of thought questions, then by all means, just dive right into Human Action.
How about this? I'm currently taking the course What's Wrong with Textbook Economics, the course you did on the Samuelson book. My question is, what is the difference between Samuelson's book and Mankiw's Principles of Economics in light of what we learned during the course? In a nutshell, can Professor Herbener describe what's wrong with Mankiw? I have a friend who's teaching an economic class using that book and haven't been able to convince him to use something more Austrian-leaning.
Yeah, well, it is true that Mankiw's book is much better than Samuelson's and much more friendly to the market. And it has certain advantages in pedagogy and other aspects that make it a much more accessible textbook. So it could be, Mankiw could be recommended as one of the better current mainstream textbooks, and again, much better than Samuelson's book. And part of the reason is that Mankiw is not an old style Keynesian in the Samuelson tradition. He's what's called a new Keynesian. And new Keynesians they've taken some of the criticism that not just Austrians would make, but other schools of thought have made of Keynes's macroeconomics. They've taken this to heart, and they've tried to improve their approach. Austrians would still criticize them, but some of the things that they've done to amend the Keynesian framework have been helpful and made their approach somewhat more realistic and more accessible to someone who's actually interested in how the world works. One of the main problems remaining with the new Keynesian approach, though, is they make just an assumption that they can't really demonstrate as being realistic of sticky wages and prices. And most of their macroeconomic models depend upon just an assumption of sticky wages and prices. So they've been criticized pretty strongly from the Austrian camp, pointing out that this assumption does not at all hold in the real world. And it's really the whole question of price, the movement, the speed of movement of adaptation of price to changes in demand and supply is really an entrepreneurial choice variable. It's really up to the entrepreneurs to choose how rapidly to allow prices to change in the face of underlying conditions. Just to give you a quick example, on the New York Stock Exchange, of course, prices change almost instantaneously. So any change in demand bids for a stock or supply offers for a stock, and the price will almost immediately change. And the reason for this is because that's what the investors want. The investors are investing on the expectation that if they're buying the stock, the price will go up, and if they're selling the stock, the prices will go down, and they want the price to change so that they can get their gain. But consumers in Walmart don't want prices to change on the floor of Walmart, moment to moment, as there's a rush of customers over to buy a DVD or, in the line for milk or whatever. We as consumers apparently like more or less stable prices. So Walmart gives us what we want. Even if there's a rush of demand, they don't just immediately raise the price. They just hold inventory and bring out the inventory and sell it at that price. And then maybe later in the week they raise the price. They just adapt to what is most preferable on the part of the participants in the market.
Question from Keith. Keith, I'm going to give you 3 links. 1, 2, and here comes 3 that may answer some of this. But Keith says, according to Mike Maloney, creator of the video series Hidden Secrets of Money, which I find excellent, he explains that since Federal Reserve currency is based on a credit system, i.e. currency is created by extending credit in the fractional reserve banking system, isn't it true that while we frequently hear the lament that the debt is too big and needs to be paid off, I agree it's hugely too big, doing so, I guess, would destroy credit and destroy currency and cause a deflation or economic crash. This is why even though lip service is paid to paying off the debt, even if possible, doing so would cause a huge cratering in the economy. So he wants to know, is that the right way to think about it?
Okay, well, there's a lot of sort of basic definitions that would be important first to note. We talk about currency. In economics, we use the word currency to refer to the actual physical paper money. So that's currency. So obviously credit and currency are not the same thing, and currency is not, so to speak, the basis of credit. Credit is a loan. And now it is true, of course, that banks produce money substitutes. They produce checking account balances, which are claims to currency, claims to money property. And they do this by creating debt. So that is true. And so if there were a debt, there could be a debt implosion in the economy, of course. If there were debt implosion in the economy, then this would correspond to a collapse of the fractional reserve banking system. But this would leave currency itself unaffected. Now, the other thing I would say, just in terms of definitions of all of this, to keep in mind when you think all of this out, there's of course a difference between the government's debt, the national debt, and private debt. Right? So these are different pools of credit. So the way that the system works is the U.S. Treasury, of course, issues the national debt, Treasury bills, Treasury bonds, Treasury notes, so that the federal government can borrow money. This is the $20 trillion outstanding national debt. And that's completely separate part of credit from private debt. So private debt would be debt of households, credit cards, mortgages, debt of businesses, AAA corporate bonds, commercial paper, and so on and so forth. So one could certainly imagine a scenario under which the federal government repudiated the national debt, just said, hey, look, we're not going to pay the bondholders of our own debt. And this would not crash the economy. It would not crash other credit markets. The other debt would still exist and presumably be paid. In fact, Rothbard argues, and I would agree with him, that while this would create a short-term turmoil, it would actually free up the credit markets and improve their efficiency. And so there would be certainly a benefit of this after some, short-term turmoil. Investors are trying to figure out whether private debt would also be repudiated. But as far as the outstanding debt and the payment of debt, remember, this is just a transfer of wealth. So with the federal government, you have bondholders and you have taxpayers. And the government is simply going to take tax money from the taxpayers and pay off the bondholders. They're just shifting wealth from one party to another. And so shifting wealth from one party to another doesn't, at least necessarily, collapse the economy. The wealth is still there. It's just who owns what. Not to say there couldn't be turmoil and so on, but I think it's a bit extreme, unless there are different scenarios one would want to pose. I think just in the normal sense of debt repudiation or debt payoff, there's no particular catastrophic effect on the economy.
Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Jeff, you're not much of a cryptocurrency guy, right?
Well, no, not in particular. I mean, I know a little about it, but
I mean, given that Murphy is another faculty guy and he actually co-authored a little book on Bitcoin, I would say to basically hold the cryptocurrency questions for Bob.
Sure.
So again, I just want to make sure everybody gets at least gets one in, and then we can go back and give people a second one. If the Fed allows interest rates to rise, do you anticipate either or both a housing or stock market crash?
I think we're in a precarious position. I think the stock market and certain parts of housing and commercial real estate are excessive, and so we do have a problem. We do have some asset bubbles that could be popped by rising interest rates. We've seen in the stock market swoon a couple of weeks ago when it fell almost 10%. This seemed to be the underlying cause, at least the main cause, was some fear of price inflation picking up and interest rates moving up accordingly. So yeah, I think there is some possibility of problems on the horizon if interest rates rise. I'm not sure about the Fed. My guess is at this point that the Fed is following and not leading. I think the yield curve has flattened. Short-term interest rates have already moved up, and long-term also, but the yield curve is flattening, and I don't think the Fed is driving this process. I think their tentative moves to raise the federal funds rate are a recognition of the fact that interest rates are starting to normalize. And if they don't normalize the Fed funds rate, then they're going to generate another gigantic asset price bubble. And so I think at this point, it's not so much that they're intentionally tightening as they are trying to make sure that their policy isn't too loose, given that it seems like interest rates are starting to normalize.
Okay, how about this? Isn't it true that higher interest can have the effect of getting more money into the economy, i.e., the banks will lend out more and thereby increase the velocity of money, causing price inflation and moving gold higher? I don't know. Are you viewing that as a good thing? I actually can't tell based on the question.
Yeah, no, I would. I don't think I follow that line. Maybe there's some other underlying part of it I'm not grasping. But higher, if we just think about the market and we don't think about the Fed manipulation of interest rates just for a second, if we just think about how the market functions, higher interest rates would not have this effect because higher interest rates are set in motion by rising time preference. And so what people do in order to generate a higher interest rate is they decide to shift their income towards more consumption spending and less saving and investing. And so the same amount of money is in the economy as before. This wouldn't necessarily affect the velocity or the demand for money. This would just be a movement between stimulating production for consumer goods and stimulating, at the expense of stimulating production for capital goods. So I would say that's the way in which the market, unhampered by government, would function in this respect.
Let's look at this question here. I have started DeSoto's Socialism, Economic Calculation, and Entrepreneurship. Now, I don't know if you've read that, Jeff. I've only read his book on money and credit.
Yeah, I have not read that book.
But you may be familiar, possibly, with DeSoto's views. He says, my perception is that DeSoto seems to be taking a somewhat extreme approach to the ideas of subjectivity and entrepreneurship. Are his definitions considered extreme among Austrians? He seems to be saying that all but a vanishingly small amount of knowledge is subjective, and practically every freely taken action is an action of entrepreneurship. All right, well, on the first thing, I don't know what his views on knowledge are, but I do know that Mises takes a fairly broad view of what constitutes entrepreneurship. Of course, I think everybody would understand that we use entrepreneurship in a colloquial sense, and then we might use it in an economic sense. And in an economic sense, it means action under uncertainty. Now, maybe it means something more specific than that, but the point is that when there is a sense in which the things people do, a lot of ordinary things people do are speculative and are done under uncertainty, and that makes them entrepreneurial. It doesn't make them entrepreneurial in the sense that you'd want to learn about them at Harvard Business School, because that's not how we think of the idea of entrepreneurship. But I think that's not an altogether useless way of thinking about the concept, because it shows that this permeates life, and that we're all to some degree acting under uncertainty. But again, I haven't read DeSoto on this. I'm just guessing based on what I've read other people say.
Right. Rothbard calls this general entrepreneurship and specialized entrepreneurship. So general entrepreneurship is the foresight that all of us have in all of our actions to penetrate the uncertainty of the future. And so if that's what DeSoto means, then he's on pretty solid ground with other Austrians. And then there's the specialized entrepreneur, of course, who's organizing production and running a business or a not-for-profit organization in the division of labor. And like Tom, I don't know what his views on knowledge are. If he thinks that knowledge is, I'm not sure what he would mean by saying that almost all knowledge is subjective. So I better not say anything about it.
Yeah, better not. All right, we don't want to get in trouble. DeSoto, who knows what happens to you. Okay. All right, let's do Alex's question, even though it's a long one, because it hits a topic that actually you and I have covered on my show. I'm confused by some of the Austrian critiques of GDP measurements. Rothbard mentions that capital investment is undercounted. There is an arbitrary distinction made between short-term investment and long-term investment. If I invest in new machinery, which will double my output next year from X to 2X, that will count toward GDP. But if I buy oil for an existing machine that would otherwise collapse next year, reducing my output from X to 0, that is not counted in GDP. Yet both investments, ceteris paribus, increase total output by X. But won't this lead to abused conclusions? Maybe he means absurd conclusions. He says, by that argument, if a vertically integrated firm creates a car worth $10,000, the production of that car should contribute $10,000 to proper GDP. But if the stages are separated, the tire company would contribute $10,000 to GDP, the axle company would contribute $10,000 to GDP, etc. So if I arbitrarily divide my firm into multiple stages, I can increase my GDP contributions indefinitely without increasing output. Is the argument that GDP-like measurements are always misfounded? Otherwise, I don't understand how the contributions of capital investment should be accounted for. Well, this sounds like he's saying that it's double counting, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are a couple things going on as I read this question. And the first is easier to deal with, and I think it addresses the double counting question. So GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a period of time. So this includes all consumer goods, goods in the hands of the final consumer, all goods in the hands of entrepreneurs, so all investment that stays in their hands. So I think in his example of the oil equipment, the drilling equipment, and the oil or whatever he said was used to maintain the equipment, both of those would count in GDP. It's just that the fixed capital would only count on an annual basis. So if you bought a machine that was going to last 20 years, only the depreciated annual amount would included in this year's GDP. So there's a difficulty in how exactly do you amortize out the investment in fixed capital. But if there's some product a company uses to maintain their fixed capital every year, like oil to grease the machine, that's counted in GDP because that is a good in the hands of the final user. And then the other point about double counting, then that's why GDP is defined this way. So there's no double counting. None of the goods in process are counted in GDP. The goods in process, though, especially in an advanced division of labor economy, they're produced by different companies, and we'd have to account for all of that. They are part of production. There are people, for example, employed in mining. And the mines do, in fact, produce a valuable product, and the product is sold at a market price. But that product, since it's a good in process that would make steel, and then the steel would make a car, and then the car is counted in GDP, the iron and the steel and the tires and the rubber and so on are not included in GDP because those products are not in the hands of the final users, and yet they're part of the economy. And in fact, a couple of years ago, the government started to calculate what they call gross output. And gross output includes all the capital goods as works in progress along the stages of production and all the final goods, because this gives us a much clear idea of the total production of everything in the whole economy. It's double counting in the sense of the final value of things. And so if we want to just know the final value of things, we just look at GDP. But if we want to know the total value of all the things produced, well, then we should look at a broader measure like a gross output.
Okay, good. And of course, we've covered that. I actually had Mark Skousen on to talk about gross output. Incidentally, I'll just say, if any of you folks, probably it's a vanishingly small number, but if any of you folks are actually in the market for webinar software, let me say, after having tried all of them, that this webinar jam actually works. It doesn't have every single feature I'd like. I'd like people to be able to ask questions where only I can see them, so it doesn't clog up the chat window, and the chat is separate from the questions. But that's a small complaint. I mean, the video quality is good. We used to have horrible lag problems with Spreecast, which no longer exists. Or there were some that were just unreliable, and I couldn't be sure the guest would be able to come on the screen. Or there's GoToWebinar, which costs like $150 a month, which we could pay here at Liberty Classroom. But why do that when we have this beautiful webinar jam, which I think it's like 2.5 months worth of that gets you the whole year of webinar jam. So anyway, I recommend it. I'm not giving out an affiliate link or anything. I'm just telling you it's a good program. Okay. In a fantasy world, could widespread alchemy cause higher inflation? Well, wouldn't widespread alchemy be, in effect, the analog in precious metals of fiduciary media in paper mode.
Yeah, it seems that way, doesn't it? Yeah, talk to those people in Venezuela and find out about that firsthand. But actually, what would happen in a world of alchemy? Let's say there was alchemy gold, so gold could be produced just out of thin air. Then, of course, people would simply switch to some other commodity that couldn't be produced
Right.
by an alchemist, right? We just switch to something else. That's the beauty of the market, is that it's all the production decisions are driven by entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs see that there's going to be a hyperinflation of their currency. They'll stop using it and adopt something else.
Let's see. Oh, somebody just said, I am in the market for webcasting software. Thanks.
There you go.
That's what I'm here for. I'm just here to help you.
Right. Another positive externality, Tom.
This one, and there's another one called Easy Webinar. Those are the only two that I can recommend wholeheartedly. All right. Well, we could talk about unfunded liability. Let's do that. Somebody's asking. What do you think the U.S. government will do regarding Social Security and Medicare unfunded liabilities? What would you suggest? I have some stuff at the end of my book, Rollback, about this and ways that you could ease the burden on the system, but while at the same time helping people. So in fact, I think this suggestion comes from George Reisman. You say to people, when you turn 65, we'll offer you a deal. You repudiate all claims that you may have on Social Security or Medicare. And in exchange, we will basically let you live tax-free. You can work all you want and keep all the money. Well, good. I would do that. So there's that possibility. I mean, there are ways of doing it, but this could be a case of it really is too late. And I always love reading Gary North's columns on this, because he says he'll critique columnists who write about the dangers of the unfunded liabilities and fiscal irresponsibility, but it's not too late. And he says,
right.
It's always not too late. And they say the same thing with climate change. Even though the world was supposed to end 10 years ago, they'll still tell us it's not too late if we just act now. At some point, they have to be honest enough and say, it is too late. Forget it. And so that's what Gary North says. He'll say, all right, here comes the part of the article where they tell us it's not too late. But you know what? I mean, basically, you're just going to have some real suffering. You're going to have severe cutbacks in benefits or severe hikes in taxes. I mean, what else could you have? I mean, really, what else could you have?
The only other thing you could have is hyperinflation.
Yeah, true. But then in practice, that turns into a cut in benefits because the money doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. Yeah,
it's worse. Right.
And then plus, because this is a long-term problem, I mean, this is a problem that's going to beset people for decades to come. It's underfunded as far as the eye can see. Inflation can only help you so long until it turns into hyperinflation. Then you wreck the currency, you start over again, you still have the same problem. You haven't really solved it. You still have underfunded liabilities for all these other people who are coming along down.
Well, but the dictator tyrant that comes in after the hyperinflation just cuts all that out, right?
Yeah, there you go.
He just repudiates everything.
That's right. We forgot that step. That's the crucial step.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. How about this? No, you know what? Frank has a very good question. And in fact, I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to Google Guido's article, Optimal Monetary Policy, which is a shocking article, really. You know the one I'm talking about? Where he basically says, optimal monetary policy is just the central bank doesn't do anything. I mean, it's just... And so Frank says, if an economy had a fixed amount of money, metals or fiat, would business cycles be avoided? Would there be negative consequences of such a policy? Now, that's not quite the same thing as what Guido is saying, but it's close enough that I'm still going to Google the article. Well, I mean, in the meantime, you can chime in.
Yeah, sure. Oh, okay, sure.
Okay, yeah.
Well, no, this would not eliminate business cycles. And of course, this sort of a scenario would have to be kept in place by government intervention itself. There's no way in an unhampered market to have a fixed amount of money. So given that we've grasped the intervention that would be necessary to keep the fiat supply of money the same on a given, what would still generate a business cycle is the credit expansion on that given fiat money, and then the shrinkage, the collapse that would come. That could be repeated over and over again, as long as we had fractional reserve banks and we had other sorts of government intervention to support the expansion of the fractional reserve banking system.
Okay, but I think he means, all right. So maybe you guys are defining fixed amount of money differently, because you could mean a fixed amount of the base.
Well,
money.
he says fiat though.
Does he? Okay.
Yeah, fixed amount of metals or fiat.
Okay.
So I took him to say that money substitutes were still expandable.
Right, but you could have a 100% reserve fiat system, even though we've never really seen it, right?
Right, but that would be
Chicago
different. Chicago did this, right? Yeah. Chicago called for this policy.
Okay.
But they did not say, let's fix the amount of fiat money. They just said, let's have 100% reserve banking, because they wanted the Fed to be able to control absolutely the expansion of the money supply.
Okay. All right. Well, I put in, again, it's not quite the same point. So I hope, Frank, you understand it's not quite to your point, but it's still a really interesting article. I put in the chat window a link to the article I mentioned. Okay, let me scroll back down now and look for anybody I may have skipped over, either by mistake or on purpose. Maybe I skipped over you on purpose. Let's see. Just because I want to, as I said, I want to make sure everybody gets their one question in. Who would you say owns the stock of the Federal Reserve? Or the main member banks? In other words, who benefits the most from the hidden taxation of government printing of money, and how to track that down? Has anyone tried to figure that out? Well, I think the stock of the Federal Reserve, in fact, here's another article I'm going to Google. There's a really good piece by, oh gosh, I'm losing my memory, Jeff. It's that guy. He's annoying, but occasionally he's good. Yeah, there's only one of those, right?
Yeah.
I'll figure it out. But can you
is it Gunning?
I beg your pardon?
Is it Gunning?
It's not. You'll know the guy as soon as I come up with him. But can you try and handle this while I look for the article that I have in mind?
Okay. What was the question again?
Well, it's like who
owns the stock, right?
Yeah.
As far as I know, the stock is owned by a group of major banks. So the major, maybe even there's some foreign bank institutions that own part of the stock. But it's my understanding that stock is not tradable.
Right.
So it's not like you could actively sell and buy shares, and they don't pay a dividend and so on. All of their surplus funding has to, by law, be turned back to the Treasury. So they do run a surplus on their books because they get interest on the national debt that they hold. And they, remarkably, they don't actually spend all that money. But they're required to turn it back to the Treasury. So this is a sort of odd arrangement of stock ownership. It's not like a regular publicly traded company.
It's Bill Woolsey.
Bill Woolsey. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
He has a real, and it's gone.
Uh-oh.
It was at Liberty Magazine, but at least now I know who it is. Hold on a minute, because it's a good piece, because he goes through and talks about exactly what makes the shares of the Fed unusual.
Yeah.
Who owns the Fed? Yeah. Bill Woolsey. Okay. Aha. Okay, wait. It's a very good piece, because he's just right about the fact that it's not a purely private institution the way some left-wing critics might say, but it's a weird hybrid. I found, it's not at the original site, but I just found it here. Really, I just put this in the chat. Read this article, everybody, because it'll save you, it'll spare you, mistakes and embarrassment maybe. But it's a really, really, really helpful overview, and it's from a guy I don't necessarily agree with on on a whole bunch of things, but he's really good on this. Okay, somebody asks, can you give us a list of who is annoying but occasionally right? I'm trying to think. I don't dare say, 'cause some of them are like friends of mine. So, all right.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay. And then somebody says, didn't know Shapiro was an economist. Oh, all right. Let's see. That's a reference to Ben Shapiro. Jeff Herbener is thankfully removed from such disputes. All right. Let's see. Why haven't we had hyperinflation yet? Is the Fed that good at managing? Like, how about let me actually tweak the question a bit. I mean, obviously
Sure.
answer that question, but how about this? How come Zimbabwe had hyperinflation, but we haven't? What's the difference there? I mean, are we just exempt from hyperinflation? But why would that be?
Yeah. Hyperinflation is always in its hyper phase. It's always a product of vanishing money demand. So even if the central bank tries to slow down a hyperinflation by stopping the printing of money at some point, it'll continue on because no one wants to hold the money. They've lost their expectations are that the money will be worthless, and so they spend it as quickly as they can, and the next person does the same, and so on and so forth. So that's the key to our current situation. Why it hasn't developed into, well, maybe not hyperinflation, but serious inflation. It's because of tremendous increase in money demand that's absorbed all of the Fed's expansion. And a lot of this has been done by the banks. The banks are still holding close to $2 trillion in excess reserves. So when the Fed engaged in all the QEs back in after the financial collapse, instead of this leading to more bank lending, the banks just sold the mortgage-backed securities and held on to the cash. And they're still holding on to a lot of that cash, and so it hasn't had any a price inflationary effect on the economy. And then you still hear stories, even this late date, 10 years after the initial financial collapse, about extremely large corporate holdings of money. So even though Apple Inc., for example, said they were going to invest $30 billion in the U.S. because of the change in the tax law under Trump, I think their cash hoard is still something like $286 billion. And they're not alone. And so there's a huge number of corporations that are still, and individuals too, who just are hoarding cash. And so we don't see the price inflationary potential until we see a normalization of credit markets, normal lending by the banks, normal money demand by, especially by big firms.
Can you explain what the term pushing on a string means?
Yeah, pushing on a string was a term that was used back in the debate between the Keynesians who were in favor, the old Keynesians who were in favor more of deficit spending and fiscal policy and monetary, and the monetarists who were in favor of monetary expansion. And this was precisely the argument that the old Keynesians made against the monetarists, who said, look, we can just have the Fed inflate our way out of recession, because they use this metaphor that Fed inflation is like pushing on a string. The Fed can push the base money all they want, but they won't get an effect on the other end of the string in spending aggregate demand in the economy because of changes in money demand, this hoarding of money, as Keynes would say. So that was actually a pretty effective metaphor for the point that they were making, which was quite correct, and we're seeing this played out again.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to note the relevance of that. All right, I started 1 minute late, so Jeff, I'm going to corral you to stay 1 minute late. It's
Sure,
my fault. I owe you 1 extra minute of your life somehow. See if I some way can get that back to you. There's a question that I thought was, has Jefferson's definition of a dollar, a fixed amount of silver, ever been replaced by some legislation? Well, I mean, it's not even just Jefferson's definition. It's the whole Constitution's definition, according to Ed Vieira and his textual analysis. Yeah. Everyone knew what a dollar was. There wasn't even, at that time, obviously there wasn't a Fed. There wasn't even a First Bank of the United States at the time they did that. So obviously the term meant something. It meant a pre-existing coin, actually. It was a Spanish coin that just happened to be in wide circulation in the U.S. But was there ever a law saying from now on we define the dollar in this way, or the dollar is whatever we say it is? I don't know that there's been legislation. I think it's just been it's just been ignored. And there's a word, not abrogated, but there's a word for you just kind of proceed as if it's not there. Or maybe there isn't such a word. I'll try and coin a word for that.
Yeah, it might appear some sort of fig leaf of legality might appear in updates to the Fed's regulatory apparatus. So, periodically there would be new banking acts and so on. In the Great Depression, there was the Monetary Decontrol Act of 1980, for example, another example. And it might be in that legislation that there was something said about the status of the dollar. But as far as I know, Tom is right. I don't know of any statute or regulatory.
Yeah, or what? I wonder though about
regulatory change.
I wonder if the courts have said anything about it in court.
No, that's possible. Yeah, that's
gold standard stuff. Yeah,
that's probably it.
I used to know some of this stuff because I read chunks of. Vieira has this book, and by the way, he is related to Meredith Vieira. They're actually brother and sister.
Wow.
Ed Vieira. He's the less popular of the two, but he has an enormous book called Pieces of Eight, and it's a history of money in America, and it's a constitutional history of money, really. And he's gone through everything. He's looked at everything. This will never be superseded. The problem is it's almost impossible to find. It's so big. It's only in research libraries. But I would have to say that's where I would look if I wanted to know for sure. But the fact that Jeff and I offhand don't know means they're not exactly going out of their way to clarify the situation.
Yeah, it's not on the Fed's website.
Right, exactly. So I don't think the average man on the street would be able to say, oh, well, of course, in 1934, we all know, we learned it in school. Okay. All right. Well, listen, that's going to do it for us for tonight. So thanks so much, everybody. We'll keep you posted on new offerings for Liberty Classroom. We've got Kevin Gutzman's going to be doing a Jefferson course for us. I got to hammer out the final details with Jeff here, but he's going to do American economic history for us. I got to check in with Brad Berzer, but I think let me just take a quick poll of interest here. If you would have an interest in a course on military history, which I know nothing about, nothing. That's my huge Achilles heel. I know nothing about military history. But we have on staff an expert, namely Brian McClanahan. Is that the kind of course anybody would have an interest in? Because if nobody would have an interest in it, we won't do it. But if yes, can you put yes in the chat box? So yes, we have a few yeses. But maybe these are the only people who are saying yes. So absolutely would have no interest whatsoever. Can you just say no? You're not going to hurt my feelings. It's just I want to allocate our resources most effectively. So okay, good. I want honesty. Do you ever get a chorus of no's to questions like that? Josh, I have a slight feeling I'm going to get a no. Don't even ask. That's why I don't even ask. Well, I think he'd be willing to do what era? I think he'd be willing to do all of U.S. history, even if he had to split it up into 2 or 3 courses. Wow. So, all right. So some people are not interested. Some people are interested. Maybe I'll even do a poll. How about that? Maybe I'll send you, if I figure out, if my little, noodle here can figure out how to do a poll, I'll send you guys an email with a poll, and you just click yes or no on that if you're interested in that. All right. But anyway, I think the preponderance of answers is yes. So maybe I'll get Brian cracking on that, because Brian, who gets up at 5 in the morning so he can do his podcast and everything in quiet, and has a really, really heavy teaching load and is always writing books, he really needs another project. So, anyway. All right. Well, thanks, everybody, for being here tonight. And keep watching your inbox. We'll get some more great faculty members doing sessions like this with you. Jeff, thanks for taking a time out of your evening to be with us. And
thanks, Tom.
We'll see y'all next time.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Tom.